Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This is episode 10 of Terminal Philosophies and I's Histories of Warfare series. And here we talk about naval warfare in the Greek context. And if we look at the history of naval warfare in antiquity, it's not really until the Peloponnesian War that we have anything remotely like a detailed account of tactics and equipment and training. But if we look at some of the earliest sort of tentative accounts and tentative speculations about naval warfare, there's essentially a Minoan hegemony of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, which we know very little about. And with the collapse of the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations, there was a Punic hegemony all throughout the Mediterranean. It continued in the Western Mediterranean up until the days of Rome. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, it continued essentially up until the rise of Athens in the 5th centuries BC. So looking at this broad early spectrum, what were the earliest ships like? Well, at the time of the 8th century, which is when Greece is beginning to claw out of its dark age, we see that there are essentially two kinds of ships. There's a lighter ship, which, and some of the sources I've read disagree on this somewhat, whether it had 20 rowers or 30, was a sort of single, it was a galley that had a single bank of oars, a single file of rowers, and a heavier ship called a pentacounter, which had 50 rows of oars, or 50 oarsmen, again, on a single platform. And so these were generally swift, smaller vessels, which were developed around, again, in Greece around the time of the end of the Dark Age. Now, the Phoenicians at the time were somewhat more advanced in sea power, which would explain their hegemony with the bireme. They increased the basic principle of the pentacounter by giving it two banks of oars, which doubled the rower base to 100 now on a ship, which gave it greater speed and greater power and greater range. And this technological edge is likely what gave the Phoenicians their local hegemony. And then the quintessential trireme, the warship of 5th, 4th, and 3rd century warfare, was, depending on who you talk to, developed either by the Phoenicians or the Corinthians. So the church father Clement of Alexandria attributes it to the Sidonians, whereas Thucydides, Pliny, and Diodorus attribute it to the Corinthians. Now, one thing that might be said against Clement's case is it's in a broader polemical work against Greeks in general. So you might argue, well, he's just trying to, grind an axe. True, but we also know that the Phoenicians were superior seamen and invented the bireme. So it's not implausible that that's the case. But earlier sources, such as Thucydides, attributed to the Corinthians. So unless Clement is referring to some earlier source than even Thucydides, I would prefer to go with the earlier source, because the earlier source is that source, which is generally closer to the events being described. But regardless, there is some dispute, and no doubt the Phoenicians became skilled trireme shipmen as well, such that when we get to the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars, the Phoenicians are generally regarded as the greatest seamen of the age, and the Greeks are dutifully concerned about their presence in the Persian fleet. So what are your thoughts on this lead-up summary to the Greco-Persian Wars?
Right. Well, I think you're dead on with mentioning the sort of Phoenician monopoly on really seafaring, and also they had this monopoly on trade, really emphasizing the southern Mediterranean and also in places like Sicily and as far west as the Rock of Gibraltar. So yeah, I think that is generally right. As you mentioned, there's some speculation as to precisely when and where naval dominance was established. I think that we can at least accredit we can credit the Phoenicians with the creation of the bireme and sort of getting the Mediterranean world started, and sort of naval dominance. I think in this build-up to the Greco-Persian Wars, you can really see just from, I mean, it's really one of the best sources that we have on, naval warfare in antiquity is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and there is this sort of concern on the part of the Greeks in reacting to this Phoenician sort of hegemony and this monopoly of trade. So, and you can see just kind of by the geography of the Aegean that the Greeks would either need to get really savvy with creating ships and training good crews, or otherwise their dominance of the Aegean would be limited to basically just the Western Asia Minor coast and the Greek mainland. So yeah, I think that's about it's a pretty good lead up into the Greco-Persian Wars.
Yeah, I think one other thing to point out about naval warfare in general at the time is that while the Greeks and the Phoenicians were both seeking to build Mediterranean colonies, the Greeks, basically speaking, colonized those areas on the northern half of the Mediterranean. So like places like Italy, Gaul, and parts of northeastern Spain, whereas the Phoenicians tended to colonize the southern Mediterranean, such as North Africa and the southern coast of Spain. And there's many different theories as to why the Greeks and the Phoenicians built these colonies further westward. But one likely reason is that given the limitations of ancient seafaring galleys, these are ships that cannot operate at sea for long periods of time, like much later ships of the line or steel vessels of the modern age. These were ships that had to be brought ashore at the end of the day so that they could be hauled up onto shore, and so that the crew and the ship could rest for the night. Because again, if the ship is in water all the time, it runs the risk of rotting out. And so if you don't absolutely have to have it at sea, you're going to want to put it on shore. Now, there are, of course, natural harbors, and there are, of course, harbors that are man-made. And I would argue that the search for these harbors was one of the reasons that drove this westward expansion of Greek and Phoenician colonies, in part so that they could protect their trade routes, because as they found more lucrative trade routes further west, for example, tin from Cornwall, grain from Sicily, and ivory from Africa, you're going to need to be able to harbor ships and then protect those ships with warships. And second of all, at the time, the two main techniques were ramming and boarding. So earlier, some of the earliest engagements were probably just land battles on sea. The quasi-naval battle, which we discussed with the Egyptians, the Battle of the Nile, was mostly just ships right next to each other fighting a land battle on sea. And that's probably how these earliest naval battles were developed. Now, we do see the development of the ram with the pentacounter and onward, but sophisticated ramming techniques and operations were probably not developed until sometime during the Greek Dark Ages, during the Phoenician hegemony. But again, little to no written records exist on this, so it's mostly speculation at this point. And I think what we see is a general trend away from boarding towards ramming, and then when we get to the Romans, it'll be back to boarding again. But at this point, we also need to remember that large amounts of funding would be needed to maintain fleets at sea. So, for example, the Persian subsidies to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, 30 talents of gold was sufficient for 55 triremes for 1 month. So you could imagine a fleet of 110 triremes for a month would be 60 talents, and that would be a pretty sizable fleet. And over a year, that would be catastrophically expensive. Only Persia could, or Athens, or the Phoenician city-states had the capital to do so. Athens and the Phoenicians from trade routes, the Persians from their massive tax base. But the need for funding these ships would facilitate trade, which would then facilitate the need to protect the trade, which would then facilitate the need to find safe harbors. And so there's this whole loop that's going on for maintaining naval hegemony. And it's what likely drove a lot of the conflict between the Persians, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, and the Phoenicians for control of naval power, also in the search of allies who might contribute funding or shipping as well. And so most naval battles were fought within sight of land, and most ships would be placed on the coast, on the shore at night, to preserve the integrity of the ships and to give the crews rest.
Right, that's exactly right. There's a big misconception, I think, on ancient naval warfare that somehow battles were waged like way out in open water, like beyond the sight of land, and that's just not the case. There's really no evidence to suggest that there were these battles out in the middle of the Mediterranean, away from any city-states or harbors. Really, these, due to the ships sort of at the time, what we could now consider as a fairly simple construction, battles had to be fought close to land because the crew really relied on the logistics of the land to keep up in order to wage war. So again, you had a lot of battles where, for example, I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but at the Battle of Aegis Potamoi, you had the the Athenian fleet destroyed by Sparta on land because, again, after a day of fighting, well, the oarsmen of all of these ships are going to be exhausted, and so you have to do something in order to, to keep the crew fed and rested. So you have to bring these triremes ashore, and triremes, while they weighed about 50 tons, well, with a crew of about 200 men, they were able to carry it up onto the beach and leave it there for the night as they make fires and prepare food and all that. But yeah, it's a common misconception that ancient naval warfare was somehow carried out in the middle of just out in the middle of the water somewhere in the Mediterranean. And yes, you're absolutely right in the sense that there became this sort of bifurcation of two very different naval doctrines between various city-states, between the Phoenician city-states, Syracuse from ancient Sicily, Athens, Sparta, and the Persian Navy. Now, as you and I were discussing, I think what we can assert about the Persian Navy is that there was really no official naval warfare doctrine ever established by the Persians, so far as we can tell, that because the evidence of the Greco-Persian invasions is somewhat sparse on the naval side of things, as well as the destruction of the Persian fleet in the storm in I can't remember where that was, that located in northern Greece, but I think we can assert that the Persians really struggled with developing any sort of lasting naval tactics. Really, the Persian Navy, in quotes, acted more as an auxiliary to the Persian army, and as more of like a transportation and logistical function as opposed to its own unique fighting force. And as we'll get into here soon, I'm sure the Athenians had quite the naval prowess in the sense that they trained their oarsmen to the degree to where they could perform these advanced and dynamic maneuvers in against their enemies, and whereas Sparta would prefer boarding enemy ships and capitalizing on their higher quality infantry to kill or force a surrender on the other crews.
So the trireme itself, the classic trireme, at least under the Athenian usage, was essentially a ship that was 37 meters long, 3 meters wide at the bottom, and then 6 meters wide at the outrigger. And it weighed about 50 tons. The average oar was 4 to 4.5 meters long. The rowers at the very bottom were the thalamites. The rowers in the middle were the zygites, and the rowers at the top were the thranites. And because the rowers at the top in the outrigger, the thranites, were the only ones that could see what was going on, they had to essentially give orders to their numbers below them so that they could row in the same unison. The ship was steered by broad oars placed at the stern of the ship much larger than the ones used by the rowers. Each trireme had 2 anchors and 2 lanterns, both at the stern end of the ship. The average Athenian complement was a crew of 200 men, 170 rowers, 10 marines, which were trained in the hoplite fashion, 4 archers, a flutist who piped time for the rowers, and then 15 deckhands. The trireme commander was a triarch, and its top speed could be about 12 kilometers per hour. And the Athenian crewmen were not slaves. They were free citizens, usually of the lower classes, which gave them a sort of, to quote in the modern terminology, that gave them skin in the game for the Athenian state. And what gave the rich skin in the game was while the state would pay the funding of the rowers and pay for the maintenance of the ships, the actual construction of the ships and the actual commander, the triarch, had to come from the noble classes. So the noble classes would be elected by lot to serve as trireme commanders, and then they would have to pay for the trireme and assemble the crews. And so it's sort of this social factor of the trireme was that it tied the Athenian state together, giving both the rich classes and the poorer classes an investment in the well-being of the city-state, tying them together for this common purpose. And what we see then here is, when we get into the Persian War itself, the fact that the Persians had so many losses at sea, about a third of their fleet off Mount Athos due to a storm, and then when they sought to outflank the Greeks at Artemisium, they lost that in a storm, tells me one of two things: either inferior construction or inferior seamanship, or both. What we've learned from modern archaeology using submersibles with the Mongol invasion of Japan and the Spanish Armada, looking at their wrecks, we can see that the sources that attributed their defeats to inferior construction, which was not able to withstand the force of a storm, was correct. And we also see with Rome in the First Punic War that naval disasters could be the result of inferior seamanship. So one or the other or both are likely the result of Persia's naval disasters and ultimate failure at Salamis. Arguably, the Phoenicians were still crack seamen, but only one contingent of a vast, bloated navy. Another thing is the Persians must have had command and control issues with people from different parts of the empire with different languages and different religions, and they just didn't have a common purpose. Whereas the Greeks would have had the same language, similar culture, fighting for their own independence. So they would have had better command and control operations. And if we look at there is no direct inference that the Greek fleet at Salamis was a heavier, more robust construction. I think it can be inferred from certain sources. Plutarch in his Noble Lives of Greeks and Romans, Thucydides, states that the Greek ships were low in the water, which indicates that they were heavy. Also, if we look at later naval developments, which we'll get to in the Peloponnesian War, heavy ships fighting in confined spaces is often a counter to superior seamen by men who know they can't defeat them in open battle. And so, as Herodotus records Thucydides saying, if we fight in the open, that's to their advantage, they being the Persian. And if we fight in the confines of Salamis, it'd be to our advantage. And it would only seem to be in their advantage if these ships were of heavier construction. So I think one can say, plausibly inferred from the evidence, that the Phoenicians pursued a strategy of light ships using sophisticated maneuvers to defeat their foes. And the Greeks, because remember, at this point, the Athenian Navy is only 3 years old. It was constructed in 483. Not yet on par with the Phoenician sailors. They then fought a more of a poor man's naval battle in confined spaces, playing to the strengths of a less well-trained fleet. And the fact that the Persians... So it's not that either side had a terribly well-developed naval strategy. The Persians viewed naval strategy as more of an adjunct to land warfare, and the Greeks were fighting in what we would call in 20th century terms area denial. So you deny the enemy access to the littoral regions or bait them into that region to destroy them. where their numbers and seamanship don't come into play.
Right. Well, it's really fascinating to see how the Greeks imposed their sort of societal organization onto their navy. I think that sort of thing was required because you require some sort of hierarchy. Well, of course, you require officers to command ships, but then you need potentially thousands of oarsmen to have a navy up and running. So whether it was by accident or on purpose, the Greeks sort of took their societal organization and imposed it both on the army and the navy. And just as you mentioned, this created a much easier command and control situation for the Greeks as opposed to for the Athenians as opposed to the Persians, because as we discussed in a previous episode, where I think we can agree, like due to the size of Persian expansion, well, that includes, of course, just dozens of different kinds of peoples with different languages, traditions, and cultures and religions, and so on and so forth. So, if you have this big sort of, quote unquote, multinational coalition going up against a sort of a homogen sorry what's the word I'm looking for, the homogeneity of the Greeks, well then of course you're going to have a difficult time with all these language barriers and sort of various levels of interest in the conflict itself. For example, I mean, many of Persia's men were hired mercenaries that had varying degrees of interest in certain battles. If they could see a battle was going badly, well, a lot of Persian mercenaries simply left because they knew that they weren't going to survive. But again, this sort of imposing Athenian society on their navy helped a lot with their own victories and made command and control much easier. Now, I think here it's probably good to mention that while we've already mentioned that the Persians really kind of used their navy just as a logistical and sort of transportation mechanism for their army, Sparta and Athens actually had their own naval doctrines. And I think, as we were sort of hinting at earlier, the Athenians had what would later be developed as more superior oarsmen and crewmen, and they were able to perform these more advanced maneuvers, like flanking maneuvers. And if you were to look down at an ancient naval warfare sort of formations, well, they are very much akin to a lot of the hoplite phalanx formations. They're like very sort of tight quarters, and each side was trying to prevent the other side. Well, excuse me, each side was trying to create gaps in the lines of ships, so that way you could either sideswipe a ship and destroy one side of its oars, sort of rendering it handicapped out in the water, or you could essentially just perform these pincer maneuvers and use the bronze ram at the front of the trireme to just plunge a hole into the ship and force it to sink. So that was sort of Athens' naval doctrine there. But I think before I get too far ahead into the Peloponnesian War, I think it's just good to mention too that you said earlier that the historian Peter Connolly had mentioned that the development of like the pentacounter with the Phoenicians, and then later on the bireme. Well, what he said is that there was really no breakthroughs in naval warfare until, of course, you have the Roman corvus. So I think before I get too far ahead into the Peloponnesian War, I'll keep it at that.
Yeah, the other aspect of Salamis that we'll see has similarities with later battles in the Peloponnesian War is that a lot of the decisive fighting was ship-to-ship boarding combat, which again, if you have a superior army or are inferior at sea, you tend to want to turn it into a land battle on sea. So what the Romans did, it's what the Spartans did. And so in some sense that it evolved into that way in the Battle of Salamis sort of implies that was most likely intended in order to negate the superior seamanship of the Phoenicians and the numbers of the Persians. Now, we don't have a whole lot of descriptions of naval warfare in the sort of golden age of Athenian hegemony from the end of the Persian Wars until the beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars. There's one battle off the coast of Asia Minor, the Battle of Eurymedon, which was a fairly decisive victory for the Greeks. And at the beginning of this Peloponnesian War, Thucydides states that the Athenian navy had an unchallenged hegemony for like 60 years, and that everybody just kind of knew you didn't challenge the Athenians. And during this time, they shifted away from the heavier construction at Salamis to a more lighter, nimble, likely Phoenician construction in order to maintain such hegemony over the seas. And in the by the time we get to the Peloponnesian War, essentially three tactics have sort of developed. There was the Prieppius, which was essentially ramming a ship in half. Imagine like a T on a piece of paper, and at the point of the crossbars where the ship smashes the other ship in half. Now, a lot of ancient sea battles with galleys, you wanted to capture enemy ships as prizes. And so while that would be effective at destroying enemy vessels, if you had a sufficiently trained crew, you would prefer the Diecipius, which was, as mentioned earlier by Toronto Philosophy, the clipping of the oars, which means you don't actually destroy the vessel. And then there was a defensive formation, which was essentially circular. And so basically you have all of the ships prows outward in this circular formation, creating a kind of porcupine formation that provides maximum defensive nature for the ships. Now, in a very unconventional method at the Battle of Colchis in 429, during the early phases of the Peloponnesian War, capitalizing on the superior seamanship, the Athenians exposed the flanks of their ships to such a defensive porcupine formation of the Lacedaemonian fleet, and sailed closer and closer to sort of constrain them into a ball, hoping that the ships would crash into each other and disable each other. And also, due to inclement weather that was incoming, it actually blew these Lacedaemonian ships into each other. And then the Athenians then swooped in and started ramming them. But again, against even remotely equally trained crew, that would have been a nearly suicidal strategy, since they would have just jutted out from the porcupine and split your ships in two. So that's the Athenian doctrine. The Athenian doctrine is to fight out in the open, to take advantage of their superior seamanship to disable and outmaneuver enemy ships, to defeat the enemy in detail. The Lacedaemonians knew that they were inferior at sea, that their seamen was inferior. The main reason why the Lacedaemonians won at sea is they had a limitless supply of funding from Persia. No matter how many naval battles they lost and how many fleets were destroyed, they could always count on Persia to provide more gold. So while it's in some sense difficult to speculate on whether Sparta could have won without Persia, it's difficult to imagine. So that needs to be kept in mind. But the techniques that Sparta and its allies developed were a sort of ensemble of strategies. The Corinthians developed a more robust beam for the hull, which could survive an impact from the Athenian ramming vessels, and would in turn give damage to the Athenian ships. Thucydides describes an account where the Athenians ram a Corinthian ship, which doesn't sink, and as they withdraw, the Corinthian outrigger sort of destroys their oars and leaves them somewhat incapacitated. The Syracusans were a little more ambitious and reinforced the prow of their ship so that it could just ram a ship prow to prow. And what we see with this is a general trend towards shorter ships that are heavier, and a preference for fighting in close quarters, like at the siege of Syracuse itself in 415 BC, or Aegis Palaemon and elsewhere in the Aegean. And we also see that the preference for boarding actions, because of course the Spartans had superior infantry formations to defeat the Athenians, and also surprise. So Lysander at Aegis Palaemon just surprises the Athenians before they can even get to their ships. If you can defeat an enemy navy while it's beached, you get all the ships, right? You get to capture all of them, which is sort of like the gold standard for this. So just quick, decisive action was a way to do it. So there's this unique ensemble of strategies that the Lacedaemonians developed to negate Athenian superiority. But again, it must be stressed that none of this would have been even remotely possible without massive Persian funding. And one can speculate whether or not Sparta could have ever defeated Athens without that funding. Now, the strategic game that Sparta was playing in the second half of the war from 415 to 404 was essentially strangling Athens' food supply and putting pressure on Athens by building a fort, a Spartan fort for a permanent garrison in Attica, and eventually strangling Athens. Whereas Athens' strategic policy was completely insane, invading Syracuse, an island larger than the entire Peloponnesus. How Athens ever thought that would achieve decisive victory is really beyond me. The Spartans decided to choke off their supply by taking the Hellespont and cutting off Black Sea grain imports. So certainly by the end of the war, Sparta had a superior strategic vision than Athens did. And more or less, this sort of balance between heavier ships in the littoral regions and lighter ships in open engagements is sort of a constant throughout the rest of Greek naval warfare until the development of the quinquereme, which is ultimately beyond the scope of this particular discussion.
Right. Well, I think it's really fascinating to kind of take into account the different construction methods of the triremes amongst these different city-states in the Mediterranean. For one, there was a archaeological discovery sometime, I think you might have to correct me on this, I think it was in the 18th or 19th century of a buried trireme in modern day Israel, somewhere along the Levant, where the bronze ram was completely intact from the trireme, and it was weighed in at approximately 1 ton. And after some analysis had been done, I think it was more or less agreed upon that the ram was constructed in one single pour of bronze, which is a pretty impressive thing even for back then. So, and that would be quite a technical thing to do for anyone in general. So it's right that the Corinthians did reinforce that center beam as a way of surviving some of these ramming attacks. But I think on the Persian sort of financing note, I think it goes without saying that without Persian funding, I don't think the war could have been waged to the extent that it did on the part of Sparta. Now, it also didn't help that, of course, the Athenians were going off into Sicily trying to capture Syracuse. That was you would have thought that they would have centralized their naval assets closer to the Peloponnese, but clearly there was some bad military thinking going on there. And yes, as you mentioned before, a lot of the Athenian population retracted behind the newly built walls of Athens, while the villages and farms outside of Athens were destroyed by Sparta, and Sparta was able to maintain sort of a quasi sort of permanent garrison close to Athens to keep them within the walls. So again, these varying naval tactics among Sparta and Athens would have all sorts of implications on the land. And again, with Athens spending so many naval assets off into places like Syracuse, away from the Greek mainland, well, that proved to not be very very helpful for them. It's interesting at the Battle of Aegis Potamoi, where Sparta, again, in this latter half of the war, was really forced to. They were successful because they were using unconventional naval tactics, whereas although Athens had a great navy and well-trained crewmen or crews, they weren't able to really adjust to sort of Sparta's spontaneity and sort of this employing unconventional tactics with all their ships being destroyed on the beach, or and really the Persian funding of the Spartan military too is just it's difficult to overstate that.
Yeah, I think the other thing that needs to be stressed again is even more so than in, say, modern naval warfare. Naval warfare was usually almost exclusively determined by the needs and demands of land warfare. So going back to the Persian War, because of the large size of the Persian invasion force, it needed a very large navy to supply it. And while some people argue that the 1,200 ships that Herodotus described is an exaggeration, um, one would have to assume that a large majority of those ships would also be transport supply ships. And so you can't reasonably count all of those as warships. And so if we assume that Herodotus is in not being very sophisticated in distinguishing between supply ships and warships, we always know that the tail end of an armed force is generally larger than the business end. It takes a lot more logistical guys to keep a guy in the field than especially back in antiquity. But regardless, there would have been a lot of supply ships, and of course, the Battle of Plataea a year later was against a much reduced Persian force because of the losses at sea. They couldn't reasonably be expected to feed all of those forces. And one of the reasons why the Persian fleet was moving in that general direction to Salamis, Athens, was to outflank any Greek holding position at the Isthmus of Corinth to attack the Peloponnesus directly. Again, as an aid to the military engagement. And we see with the Peloponnesian War, with the use of naval power, what is it for? It's to achieve some victories on land. So, for example, the great victory with Peltas and Marines at Pylos against the Spartans in 425 BC by Demosthenes. I mean, again, his entire operation would have been impossible without naval assets. And so, but again, the naval assets were used in the service of some tactical ground operation. In the 460s BC and the 450s BC, Egypt was in revolt against Persia. So much of Athens' naval engagements in Cyprus and elsewhere were there to support the Egyptian independence movement. And so the idea of a sort of independent naval strategy, like we might see in the Pacific theater of World War II, isn't really the case in antiquity.
Right, and I think one thing that's fair to mention right here is the sort of various wars and conflicts of the Delian League that led up to that would eventually lead to the Peloponnesian War. I mean, really, what you have is something like you had this sort of quasi-Greek expeditionary force defeated and sent away from Egypt, and also Persia loses control over places like Thrace and the western coast of modern-day Turkey. So, and a lot of that was, at least that second part, with Persia losing control over western Asia Minor. A lot of that is due to just more of a more rigorous naval doctrine, whereas I think the Persians, again, with maintaining that size of an empire at the time, um, I think that again, the navy for the Persians was just never the focus. I mean, if you look back, if you comb through history, it's really difficult to find even a single a good set of evidence to suggest that the Persians were victorious uh, on sea. Now, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, and of course, the Greeks didn't win every conflict when they were sort of known as the Delian League. But again, I think the emphasis on naval warfare is brought fairly clear with the wars of the Delian League, and of course the Salamis and Cyprus and Eurymedon and so on and so forth. You're also right too that when Herodotus was sort of recalling certain details of the Athenian navy, that there was that I remember there wasn't much effort to put in to distinguish warships from supply and logistical ships. So that's an interesting point as well. It's kind of fascinating to sort of think about the logistical constraints of warfare in antiquity. If it was difficult for in a nation of the modern era to supply troops on the front line, well, you can imagine what the repercussions were for populations of antiquity to try and maintain a fighting force. So it was probably logistically disastrous for many city-states to wage war for any period of time, even well-funded and more rich city-states.
Yes, I think another point to bring up as well, if is get again, given the lack of direct historical evidence as to Greek doctrine in the Battle of Salamis or earlier Phoenician hegemony doctrine, due to the collapse of the Bronze Age Greek kingdoms in the 13th century, of sort of interpreting those formations in light of what we know from Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. Some people might say, well, that was hundreds of years later. How can we? Well, I would want to assume that you could extrapolate that backwards. So, like for example, if a historian 1,000 years hence looked at World War I and World War II and then said, well, we don't have a lot of written records that have been preserved from that period for whatever reason, and they're going to assume that the battles of World War II were fought anything like the battles of World War I, even though they're only 20 years apart. That would not be a warranted assumption. But that's because technology and the rate of change was greatly accelerated in the 20th century. In antiquity, the rate of change was very slow. As we've mentioned with Peter Connolly, naval tactics did not change that much. So I think it's a safe assumption that what holds true in the Peloponnesian War probably held true almost certainly held true in the Persian Wars, and probably held true during the Phoenician hegemony. And again, this is because we don't see this rapid rate of change. Now, again, these are only educated guesses, but I think that they are sound guesses based on what we know from other sources of ancient naval warfare, which again, in general, is very sparse.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, again, we're still firmly in antiquity. So again, the certainties of a lot of these historical events is still will forever be up for debate. But yes, I think thankfully we do have Thucydides, we have Herodotus and Xenophon to sort of pontificate on ancient warfare. But I think we can firmly at least establish that Sparta and Athens had distinct naval doctrines from each other, and based off of before the Peloponnesian War ever broke out, uh, there's at least the formation of the Delian League, and you have sort of this a bit of Greek expansion into various parts of the Mediterranean, where you are starting to see the formation of certain things like kind of an amphibious and sort of combined arms tactic being applied to certain places. Although the expedition to Egypt was unsuccessful, a lot of these various expeditions were able to drive Persia out of Western Asia Minor, and a lot of, really after the wars of the Delian League, there's not much Persian naval presence to really speak of, unless, of course, there's at that point Persia really becomes sort of again, there's still this regional empire, but they become sort of the financier for Sparta's ability to wage war against Athens in the later Peloponnesian War. But yes, Peter Connolly, as we mentioned before, I think, again, even though he's working off of the same availability of evidence that we are, I think it's fine to state that really ancient naval warfare wasn't really changed all that much, or didn't really experience any quantum leaps in technological innovation until, of course, the Roman era with the inception of the Corvus. So I think that we can really think of ancient naval warfare in this period as well timed and well crewed. It's a mix between timing, having well trained crews, and planning out your logistics ahead of time. If you're going from point A to point B with a certain fleet, well, you're going to have to figure out where you're going to beach all of the ships for the night. And if you haven't planned out, if you don't have any city states or towns or coastal villages that are willing to essentially accept your crews to beach the ships at that time, well then you're going to have starving and exhausted crews in about a day. So again, it really required a lot of planning. And again, due to the Athenian sort of, again, this is kind of just speculation on my part, but due to the outcome of the Aegis Potamoi, I think we can assume that by that point, the Athenian navy was sort of out of tricks, and they were good at what they could do as far as these advanced maneuvers and having highly disciplined crews. But I don't think that they were really well. They weren't very well equipped to deal with these sort of surprise attacks and unconventional tactics that Sparta would eventually use against them.
Yeah, exactly. So again, to recap, basically there's two styles of naval combat that develop in this period. One is the more what we might call pure dedicated naval combat based on a trained cadre of rowers and seamen that use sophisticated ramming maneuvers and flanking maneuvers to achieve victory at sea. And then there's what we might call the more poor man's naval combat, where if you don't have a naval tradition and you tend to have a superior army, then you're going to prefer ships that are more robust, bulkier, can carry more marines, and fight a land battle at sea. And so it's really oscillates between those two, and it depends upon the real nature or structure of the contending forces. So the Athenians and the Phoenicians would generally prefer the lighter, more maneuverable vessels, whereas the Lacedaemonians would prefer Sparta and its allies, Corinth and Syracuse, would later prefer heavier ships that they could use to carry more marines and ram, essentially take a hit from the Athenian ships. So, and that trend generally continues through even the Roman period. And that seems to be the oscillation between styles of galley warfare at that time.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I think just as a closing statement, again, naval warfare at this time was fairly simplistic in the sense that there was no, at least for this period, there was no projectiles being fired from ships other than archers and javelins, and the Athenians would do that, of course, to harass their enemies. But whereas Sparta, that was the main point of naval warfare, was to get their infantry onto other enemy ships. So yeah, you have these this bifurcation of naval tactics amongst these different city-states. And again, I just think it's important for the average listener or the average observer of this era of warfare to note that, again, we don't really have any solid evidence of large battles or battles taking place way out, in the middle of the Aegean or the Mediterranean. These ships were almost entirely dependent on staying close to land, as they couldn't really survive rough storms, and they really they weren't set up logistically to go out into the water for longer than probably a day or two, because the crew will get exhausted and they don't really have there's really no food brought aboard or the ability to stay out in the water for days or weeks at a time. So, and again, this wouldn't change until the Roman era, but it's a fascinating time in history.
Well, thanks again, Swithin, or Terminal Philosophy.
You're good. Thanks, man.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. This is Praise of Folly signing off.